Well, it's 6 o'clock, but we're still waiting for 3 panelists. Oh, we're down to 2. All right, we're just waiting for one more person. Well, I tell you what, why don't we get started? We have a lot of people. We have 41 attendees. So first, I want to thank everyone to the 3rd LPC workshop. Tonight's is going to be focused on sea level rise and precipitation and flooding. I want to thank all the panelists. They've all put in a lot of effort to tailor presentations to the specific needs of what we're looking for this evening. And we have a very good representation. DNREC has been extremely supportive, as well as University of Delaware and other organizations. If we just keep all the audio off unless speaking, this way it reduces background noise. Questions can be submitted using the chat window. We will stop at convenient breakpoints in the topics, and Janelle will read those comments, questions, and then we'll have a chance at the end for any summary comments. Janelle will be driving the slide deck. So for all the panelists, if you can just, we've got them in order, just indicate when you want the slides to be advanced. Janelle will provide a 2-minute warning as you get to the 15-minute point. This way we can keep the schedule moving. We do have the Zoom call blocked for 2.5 hours. So this should allow us adequate time to get through the presentations and questions. If there are additional questions, we can take them offline and address them at the Sea Level Committee. And separately from what we're doing tonight, each of the participants has been sent a draft of what the Sea Level Committee has currently proposed for a draft ordinance. We won't discuss that this evening, but there will be an upcoming public hearing for the draft ordinance and for the public to have a chance to comment on that ordinance. Tonight is really an educational program based upon sea level rise and flooding. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our first speaker, who's Gina Todd from DNREC. Gina, welcome.
Thank you. All right, so I'm an engineer with DNREC Shoreline and Waterway Management section, which is part of the Division of Watershed Stewardship. And I'm just going to speak real briefly tonight about coastal floodplain mapping. All right, so you know, the main reason I wanted to talk about floodplain mapping with you is because it's an important thing to understand when you're thinking about managing coastal development and sea level rise. And most of the floodplain mapping that you'll see is generated by Fema as part of the National Flood Insurance Program. So the maps that Fema generates are called Flood Insurance Rate Maps, abbreviated FIRM, and they show the mapping of flood zones, primarily for flood insurance rating purposes, although they're used for many other purposes. And the floodplain that's delineated on the maps is called the Special Flood Hazard Area. And this is the area that has a 1% annual chance of flooding. It's also known as the 100-year floodplain. And within that area, there's a mandatory flood insurance purchase requirement for homes that have a federally backed mortgage. FEMA floodplain maps are updated periodically, but not necessarily on any sort of regular schedule. And the maps are typically used by communities in the regulation of land use. Next slide, please. So there's a number of different flood zones that are shown on FEMA floodplain maps. So within the special flood hazard area, there's different types of A and V zones. These, again, are the 1% annual chance floodplain, with the difference being that V zones show areas that are subject to velocity hazard or basically wave action. And then areas outside of the special flood hazard area are designated X zones, and there's a shaded zone X. This is the 500-year floodplain, or also called the 0.2% annual chance floodplain. It's considered an area of moderate flood risk. And then anything outside of that shaded area is basically the low hazard area, so less than a 1 in 500 year storm. Next slide, please. All right, so I wanted to talk a little bit about how coastal floodplain modeling and mapping works. So you can see here on the image, there's different flood zone areas are sort of designated. There's a VE zone, area that would be expected to have wave height greater than or equal to 3 feet. There's a coastal AE zone, which is still subject to waves in the range of 1.5 to 3 feet. And this is in the 1% annual chance storm. Then there's an AE zone that's waves less than 1.5 feet. And then outside of that is the zone X, which I mentioned. And so there's a couple of different types of analysis that go into producing coastal floodplain maps. There's analysis of storm surge, which is used to generate sort of what's called the still water elevation. And then there's wave modeling that's done on top of that to figure out how much height waves would add to the flood elevation. And so the still water or the elevations, the storm surge analysis is done sort of on a regional scale. So this might be, you know, multiple states or a large coastal area that's involved. And the overland wave modeling is done on a little bit more local scale. And that's typically for FEMA maps only done for the 1% annual chance storm. Next slide, please. So floodplain maps have many uses and you know, many benefits, but there are limitations to them which you should be aware of if you're using them for various purposes. So they're based on conditions at the time of the study, so when the model was generated. So things like topography and hydrology that can change over time, you know, those changes may not be captured. Other future conditions are not considered. So things like sea level rise, changes in storm climatology, et cetera, are not factored into these maps. And there's also no consideration of back-to-back storms. So the mapping's based on, you know, an individual 1% annual chance storm, you know, not multiple big storms happening, you know, in close succession. So that can have an impact as well. And then, as I mentioned on the previous slide, the 500-year coastal floodplain is based on still water elevations only. So if you were to look at the floodplain maps for Lewes, there are shaded zone X or 500-year floodplains shown in some areas, but it's important to realize that that those floodplains don't take into account waves that might kind of expand the flood heights or expand the 500-year floodplain in those conditions. All right. So one of the ways that you can view FEMA floodplain maps is through our Delaware flood planning tool. So this is a DNREC interactive web map application. The web address is shown here. And this is a tool basically to display effective FEMA mapping along with other features that you may find useful. The tool is currently undergoing some updates, which will be released hopefully soon. There'll be kind of an updated user interface. And then also sea level rise mapping will be added to the tool so that you can view that along with floodplain mapping. Next slide. And here's my contact information. If you have any questions about floodplain mapping, I'd be happy to answer them.
Thank you, Gina. Next up, we have Mike Powell from DNREC also.
Thank you, Tom. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I am the administrator of the Shoreline and Waterway Management section for DNREC, and I'm going to talk about primarily increased floodplain development standards. And I'm going to use the report that was developed for the Senate Bill 64 Floodplain and Drainage Advisory Committee in 2013, because I believe that represents the nearest thing that we have in Delaware to a consensus for recommendations for communities to use for higher floodplain standards. There are certainly many resources out there for higher floodplain development standards. And the Association of State Floodplain Managers is a great resource for getting at some of those higher floodplain standards. But I wanted to stick to ones that have gone through kind of a vetting process in Delaware and kind of stay with some of the standards that I think Lewes might be interested in and may have already considered. So next slide. This is just a slide showing the participants in the Floodplain and Drainage Advisory Committee. It was very much intended to be a committee that represented a wide range of viewpoints, from the land development community to realtors to communities, Department of Transportation, and a variety of other participants. There was certainly not unanimous consensus about all of these standards, but the majority of the, and there was a lot of spirited debate about the upsides and downsides of many of the standards that I'm going to talk about, and other standards that I'm not going to talk about, but are in that floodplain and drainage advisory report. Next slide. So this is a slide that I wanted to explain that the work that the Floodplain and Drainage Advisory Committee did was largely as a result of the fact that when catastrophic flooding occurs, there is a threshold, and that's been reached in Delaware, upstate and downstate, where very costly publicly funded action is likely. So the motivation for these higher floodplain standards are in part simply to recognize that if we don't build to a sufficient floodplain standard, our communities are going to experience significant financial burdens responding to the inevitable flood damage that will occur if we build to lower standards. Next slide. I'm going to primarily talk about 5 higher standards that Lewes may wish to consider or may already be considering. Requiring 18 inches of freeboard for new construction. By freeboard, I mean requiring that new construction new development have the floors of buildings elevated 18 inches above the 100-year flood elevation. Recommending that when shallow fill is used to elevate the grade of developments, that raising that ground elevation slightly above base flood elevation, which can remove it from the floodplain, should not exempt that development from floodplain regulations. It's simply risky to fill ground on a site to a few tenths of a foot or a foot above the regulatory flood elevation, and then remove it from the floodplain and drop all floodplain protections. Prohibit or limit subdividing of land in the floodplain, and kind of hand in hand with that is to prohibit new buildings in floodplains in newly subdivided land. So the committee recognized that in some cases it may make sense to simply prohibit subdividing of land in the floodplain. Where that's not possible, the subdividing can occur in a way that no new structures are built in the floodplain. And I'll show some slides to illustrate what I mean by that. And then the final one is to really look hard at encroachments, meaning filling in the floodplain, because of the inevitable concern that when you place fill in a floodplain, and this is more of a non-tidal concept, but Lewes is certainly one of those areas that has both tidal and non-tidal flooding impacts, that doing so in a way that causes more than just a slight amount of rise is going to have unintended consequences to neighbors. And when I speak about the floodplain, I am primarily referring to the 100-year floodplain or the 1% annual chance floodplain. There's always a concern that higher standards are going to cost a lot more. And I wanted to show a slide here with results from a 2017 Association of State Floodplain Managers study on the costs and savings for elevating a home 2 feet above the 100-year flood elevation on a crawl space. The return is fantastic for doing that. They found that the higher cost of constructing the house with that 2 feet of freeboard would be under $5,000, and the insurance savings per year, and this is 3 years ago, was $734 a year, and the payback time was the payoff time for that investment was less than 4 years. Let's say 3.5 years before the to enjoy a return on that investment for freeboard. And that doesn't include the fact that you're much less likely to get flooded and have a whole bunch of I guess I'd say, you know, ancillary impacts to your home. This is just saving you in flood insurance. Next slide. So when we talk about not removing land from floodplain regulations when it is filled, what I'm showing you on this slide is a very common process where land development will result in filling of land even just a 1/10 of a foot or two above the 1% annual flood elevation. And then FEMA can and frequently does remove that land from the regulatory floodplain. Once again, because the land has been elevated to a few inches above the 1% or 100-year flood level. To remove that land from the floodplain by just a few 1/10 of a foot and drop all floodplain standards is really quite risky. There's a tremendous amount of uncertainty in these flood levels. There's plenty of evidence that they're increasing over time. So to remove development from the floodplain and remove floodplain management requirements is likely to result in that development becoming at risk in the future. Next slide. So one of the concepts that the committee talked about a lot was ways to steer development outside of the floodplain entirely. And these two slides are showing two recommendations that the committee made. One is to lay out a subdivision, and the image on the left is kind of showing a subdivision laid out with the lots completely out of the floodplain, and the interior part of the floodplain is perhaps in the development but held as open space. Recognizing that that sometimes can have some concerns about community open space where they may not want that. The image on the right is showing the lots laid out in a manner that's deep enough that the backs of the properties are in a floodplain, but there's ample room to build houses outside the floodplain. This is one of the most important recommendations that I can have, is to try to limit growth in the floodplain, because it's inevitable that building in the floodplain as flood risks increase will result in hardship down the road. Next slide. When we talk about filling, this is a busy slide, but what I want you to get out of it is the fact that the floodplain becomes wider and may take in new houses or buildings, and the floodplain level becomes higher when filling occurs and encroachment reduce the capacity of the floodplain to carry floodwaters, to hold floodwaters. This is mostly a non-tidal concept. Riverine floodplains, this is much more of a well-established concern, but there is plenty of evidence that even in tidal floodplains, constricting the floodplain carrying capacity can cause flood height increases. Next slide. Tom asked me to comment on the use of 500-year flood elevations as a higher standard. Gina touched on the fact that the studies for our area are still water only. They don't account for dune breaching. And a 500-year storm is really a catastrophic event where we would expect to see barrier island geomorphological changes, dune deteriorations, or outright breaching. And we have simply not done the modeling in Delaware to understand how high the water would get in a 500-year storm because of all of those uncertainties. The 500-year stillwater elevations in the Lewes area are only about 1.2 to 1.7 feet above the 1% or 100-year stillwater elevations, so not a lot higher. And probably my recommendation, because the 500-year level has not really been adequately determined, is to use the 100-year base flood elevation as a higher standard, and then start incorporating freeboard, sea level rise accounting, and the uncertainty, just simply because it's quite likely that the 1% flood level is more accurate than the 500-year flood level. I believe that was my last slide, and there's my contact information.
Okay, I think at this point, Janelle, let's take some of the questions for Mike and Gina, and then we can move on.
So let me get to the chat.
And just for everyone's information, the slides are currently up on the city website. If you go to planning projects, sea level rise, and then 2020 workshop, and you click on the person's name, the slides are underneath there. So sorry for not making that clearer in the agenda, but the slide decks are all up on the web right now.
So the one question we have currently is, can you address groundwater level rise and ways we can work to address this threat to Lewes?
Janelle, I'm not an expert in groundwater levels, so I don't really have a comment about that.
Okay, and then the next question is, the FEMA flood maps have been around for a while. How accurate have they proved to be in predicting where flooding will occur?
That's a good question. You know, the maps are based on models and are calibrated. I mean, yeah, the studies and the models are calibrated to high water marks and things like that when they can be, but you know, it just varies. It varies place to place. I haven't looked specifically into it in Lewes to see, you know, how the floodplain map compares to, you know, water levels for certain storms, but that's certainly something, you know, that wouldn't be too hard to do.
And the last question we had was, which floodplain? There are many levels, and I believe, Mike, you mentioned you were using the 100-year.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and Gina and Mike. Mike, I think you've presented a lot of material that will be good not only for our sea level rise committee, but also for the other committees like floodplain management. So thank you. Moving on, next we have Kevin Brinson up.
Yep. Thank you, Tom. So this presentation is on precipitation. There's maybe a little bit of a twist here. I'm not going to speak too much, or in fact, I'm not going to speak at all about sea level rise in this presentation. Before I get started, I just want to acknowledge that this is a team effort. This presentation, the work that went in behind this presentation, those are my collaborators there on the second line. And this is a work that we published in a journal, but I think it has very practical implications for how we use precipitation information for making decisions. So next slide. So many of you are familiar with stormwater structures. That's a stormwater retention basin here. Of course, what they're used for. And of course, many of them have certain specifications or designed events that they're built to handle. In case, Mike mentioned the 100-year storm, and that's, in many cases what these are designed to do, or maybe even different size events depending on what the expected duration expected life of a particular structure is. So next slide. So when we talk about 100-year events, I think many people maybe understands this, but we often think of 100-year events as something that only happens once every 100 years, and that's not really what a 100-year event is. I think it's important to kind of communicate that here. Is it's an event that has the chance of happening, once every 100 years. It has a 1% chance of happening. But you can have multiple 100-year events within a few years of each other, or even within the same year, which actually has happened, from a rainfall standpoint before. So, an X-year event, whether 100 or 500-year event, remember, it's important to keep in mind they're statistically derived. They don't have to have ever occurred in a history of a location. And in fact, for a 500-year event, we don't have 500 years of data, so we can't say a 500-year event has actually occurred in the 500-year record. So keep going. So for many precipitation frequency studies, the sort of the de facto standard that many folks use is called NOAA Atlas 14. It's a sort of a publication that has been, it's been well put together. The information in it is very good, but it's been sort of cobbled together over time. It's been done sort of piecemeal in different regions around the country as funding has come available. So right now there may be an effort going on. In fact, I know there's one going on in the Pacific Northwest to update Atlas 14 for that region. Our region, which I guess was kind of like the Mid-Atlantic, which actually included parts of the Midwest, was done several years ago. And there's really no plans at the moment to update our region in Atlas 14. But what Atlas 14 provides is essentially the frequency of certain size rainfall events over different durations, which you can see there in the bottom right-hand corner. There's a graph there that shows the different durations and different recurrence intervals, which are those different lines you see there. And so what we did in our study is what we're about to present to you or show you is we compared how putting in additional information might affect how often in our statistics a certain size event can occur. Next slide. So what's important to keep in mind is how many places the Atlas 14 study used for Delaware to come up with our precipitation frequencies. Those green squares on the left-hand side there show you the locations they used. On the right-hand side is the network called Delaware Environmental Observing System, which is run by our center at the University of Delaware. And that's the distribution of stations in our network, which has been around for roughly 15 years now. And you can see there's a lot more of those locations on the right than there are on the left. So what we wanted to do is add in our stations that had long periods of record and sort of recalculate these precipitation frequencies to see how they differed from Atlas 14. Next slide. So basically what it says is, research questions, with more stations in Delaware, how will a higher spatial resolution of precipitation observations impact estimates of extreme precipitation return periods and magnitudes? In other words, could Atlas 14 benefit from including more, in this case we call it mesonet data, which is just data from our network in Delaware. Could Atlas 14 benefit from including more data? Next slide. So this shows the 10-year recurrence interval exceedance, what we call exceedance events. Basically, these are events where the 10-year event was exceeded for the different durations you see there, 24-hour, 120-minute, and 5-minute. Since our network has the ability to do 5-minute resolution data, that's why we included it in here. And Atlas 14 actually does include 5-minute duration values, but the data below 24 hours in Atlas 14 is even more sparse, just because there are fewer stations that were included in Atlas 14 that took more frequent data than once a day. or more frequent observations than once a day. So you can see on there on the left, the 24-hour values within a 10-year period. All those red dots you see there meant they had 4 10-year events within a 10-year period. And that's why I was kind of mentioning earlier. It's important to remember that a 10-year event isn't something that only happens once every 10 years. It can actually happen more frequently than that. And you can see one of the locations is very close to Lewes there at Rehoboth Beach, or in our network, we saw 4 10-year events within a 10-year period. As you go further out, as the duration decreases, in other words, it goes down in duration, you can see the number of exceedances also decreases. And I won't go into that here, but that was just one of our findings here. But the key takeaway here is that a 10-year event doesn't always happen once every 10 years if you use more data. Next slide. This also shows the percentage of exceedance for these different areas. And you can see there for a 10-year event, some of these places were exceeding by almost double what a 10-year event would be. So let's say, 5 inches was a 10-year value or 10-year event for a particular location. These areas where you have 200% increase or 200% exceedance, those were getting 10 inches on these during these 10-year periods. So not only are we more frequently seeing a 10-year event, but we're also exceeding it by a lot. Next slide. So what are our findings from the study was basically that by adding additional data, the rainfall amounts associated with various return intervals at virtually all durations is larger. So we expect to see that a 10-year event defined in Atlas 14 is probably something different. Is this because more data are added? Or, oh, sorry, that doesn't even make sense there. It's because we added more data, or is thus a greater likelihood of it capturing extremes? I'm not sure. Is it due to climate change? Again, we weren't able to determine that from just this study alone. But the bottom line here is we may be undersizing some of our structures, and because we are not truly sampling what's happening out there in terms of our precipitation data. By having more observations, we can more accurately represent what's actually happening in our climate and our weather, which is, I guess, maybe not the most shocking thing, but when you're basing a lot of your designs off of a particular standard that may not have all the data in it, that could be something to consider. So we probably are not adequately capturing our extremes in our NOAA Atlas 14. Next slide. Just want to real quick mention that we did have a new 24-hour state precipitation record that was declared for the state of Delaware. We had 12.48 inches measured at one of our geostations in Harbison. And the interesting thing about that is you can have extreme within extremes. 4.26 inches fell in 1 hour on September 29th. So just think about 4¼ inches of rain in 24 hours, or sorry, 1 hour. In which, a 1,000-year event for a 60-minute period for that location is 4.18. So technically we had a 1,000-year event for 1 hour during that event. The 24-hour event itself was about a 300 to 500-year event. And if you want to find more information about that particular record, you can go to that link on the bottom there. Next slide. And so this is my slide for questions. You can see there's the citation for the paper if you want to see more detailed information about this particular study. And that's it.
Thank you very much, Kevin. I think at this point we'll take questions because I think this is a critical part of our stormwater management and flooding issues. So Janelle?
So we only have one question. It's how should we possibly modify our stormwater systems given Kevin's presentation?
Well, I'm not a civil engineer, so I can't really say exactly how you should do it. But the one thing I would say is that the 100-year event or whatever it is that your basis is on, there's two things happening. One is I'm not sure that the 100-year event amount, so let's say it's a 2.5 inches, is exactly accurate. I think and more likely is that a 100-year event is something larger that we need to sort of kind of keep in mind, sort of hedge our bets a little bit. That's probably where the real value is. The other thing to keep in mind is that there is a trend for our area showing that precipitation is getting more extreme. And if based on the climate projections we have for Delaware, we anticipate that things could become more extreme in the future. So with climate change, that could become more problematic. If in fact the 100-year event is getting larger and larger over time. We haven't been able to show that statistically just yet, but based on our climate projections, we believe that will probably be the case.
And we do have Jessica Watson from Sussex County Conservation District up later on. And I think at that point, Sumner's question would be one that we'd open up to a larger discussion, because that is a real concern, both from structural integrity as well as flooding issues. Gina, I think that was the last, oh, one second.
We got one more question, and I'm not sure who can answer it. Maybe Jessica might be able to help us down the road. That somebody had their stormwater pond backed up with surge, high tide, and winds, killing the little fish with brackish water. Does the outlet have to be raised?
Janelle, this is Jessica speaking. Did you want me to answer that or just wait till later on?
If you can answer it, go.
Okay. I mean, that is something that we experience. And there's really not much that we can do about it when those things occur. I'll go into it a little bit more during my presentation. The stormwater program's been around since 1991, so things have definitely changed. Storm events have changed. The 100-year storm has increased. And in some cases, we're definitely dealing with very fixed elevations, so there's not a whole lot that we can do. Sometimes we talk about putting tide flex valves at the end of these structures. Sometimes it works, and sometimes, it's better just to leave it the way it is.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think Jessica's got very good information later on what their role is in stormwater management design. Okay, then we'll move on to, if there's no other ones coming in, let's look to Bob Scarborough from DNREC.
Good evening, everyone. Like Tom said, I'm Bob Scarborough. I'm the program manager for the Delaware Coastal Programs in DNREC, and our program has been assessing the impacts of sea level rise and supporting adaptation in Delaware for more than a decade now. Next slide, please. In 2009, as part of the State Sea Level Rise Initiative, we developed sea level rise planning scenarios. These scenarios back then were based on analysis of sea level rise projections used by numerous federal and international agencies, and then adjusted for Delaware with local land subsidence values. In 2017, we decided to review the sea level rise scenarios as new data and better models have become available. The coastal programs contracted with the Delaware Geological Survey, or DGS, at the university to lead the effort along with a technical advisory committee. The analysis was based on a scientific method that combined the latest physical climate model results from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, better known as IPCC, with local data and input it into a probabilistic model. And this is the same model used by NOAA and many other agencies. As this was a probabilistic model this time, we can now give statistical levels of certainty with the scenarios. On the chart, the blue or low level corresponds to a 95% certainty that sea level rise will reach that line or higher for the given year in the chart. The intermediate or green line corresponds to a 50% certainty that sea level will at least reach that point. And the high scenario or red line corresponds to a 5% chance that sea level rise could be above that point. Another feature of this model is that the results can be projected for any given year. So depending on the planning scenario that you're looking at, there's a probability curve value to use. You might have seen other data from NOAA or others indicating possibly higher levels of sea level rise. As mentioned, NOAA uses the same model, but they often use different levels of certainty in their outputs. You might have seen levels of 8 feet or even higher as projected sea level rise by 2100. But for these, they're using a 1% or smaller confidence level. So if you look at it another way, they're saying they're 99% confident that sea level rise will not go any higher than that level. It was the decision of the advisory committee to use the 5, 50, and 95% confident intervals just to maintain some reasonable bounds for most planning purposes. This depends on the longevity of the project and the amount of acceptable risk. We are now planning to review the models again, probably in 2020, as this will correspond to the next plan, IPCC assessment report, AR number 6. So that's supposed to be out in the spring of 2022, and we'll readjust these things as needed then. The report is available on the DGS website. There are links to it from various sources. Some of them will probably be mentioned tonight. Next slide, please. In conjunction with the planning scenarios, we had DGS create new inundation maps. The old maps from 2009 just indicated the 3 inundation scenarios for the year 2100. These new maps show inundation levels at 1 foot increments above mean high or high water up to mean high or high water plus 7 feet. Of course, there are a few caveats with these maps, primarily that they are what we call bathtub models, which means anything hydraulically connected to open water at a certain elevation becomes instantly flooded when it becomes that level. Excuse me. So it does not take into account the time water would need to move inland or any restrictions that would limit the amount of water flow through a passage. These maps also do not account for upstream inputs. As I said, they are based off of mean higher of the 2 daily tides in the 28-day tidal cycle. So the spring tides are higher than the mean higher high water level, and mean tides are lower. So it's just for planning purposes here. These are not set in stone. In addition to whatever sea level rise planning level is chosen, storm surges can also be included by selecting higher inundation levels. Again, with the understanding that the bathtub model, which may not accurately show the flooding impacts of storm surges. On the map here, for Lewes, we have the dark blue, which is the mean higher high water level. The light blue, which is 1 foot above mean higher high water, 3 foot, which is the green, and 5 feet in gold above mean higher high water. These are adjustable. You can click whichever increment you want on or off, zoom in across the state for this. The maps are available on First Map. They are through the DGS website. We're currently working with DGS to make a more user-friendly and directly accessible dedicated website for them. And I think these are the maps that Gina had mentioned that are also going to be included on their website. Next slide, please. Okay, so now that you know where and what might be impacted by sea level rise, what are the options available to deal with it? Adaptation strategies fall into 4 categories: avoid, protect, accommodate, and retreat. Next slide, please. The simplest strategy is to avoid areas that are prone to flooding or may be flooded with sea level rise. In certain areas, it is possible that alternative uses can be maintained in these areas, such as sports fields, picnic areas, trails, or other outdoor recreation, with the idea that there will be minimum damage to any built property if the area is flooded, and use by the public can be restricted when flooding is present or expected. Next slide. The next strategy is to protect. Protection reduces the chances of a hazard occurring. With sea level rise, these hazards are most often flooding and coastal erosion. Protection comes in 3 varieties: hard or gray, which are man-made barriers like berms, dikes, seawalls, breakwaters. The next variety is soft or green protection, including things like living shorelines, protection or creation of wetlands, beach nourishment, and dune grass plantings. While living shorelines or wetlands may not fully protect the area from flooding, they will absorb some of the wave energy and provide water storage potential. Dune grasses help stabilize the dunes and provide protection from coastal storms. The third option are hybrids of hard and soft. An example may be a shoreline project that contains smaller rock berms with living shorelines planted behind. Some of the examples are shown, especially for the bigger man-made. The second picture, that's Cape May, New Jersey, with the rock abutment. The one on the far right is a homeowner's berm that they put along Delaware Bay there. Next slide, please. To accommodate the sea level rise means to reduce the vulnerability to the public structures and environment. This can take place in numerous ways. The most obvious is to raise buildings, air conditioners, fuel tanks, etc., so that they are above flood levels. Buildings that can't be raised may be able to be flood proofed. Rain gardens can be installed to hold and improve infiltration of runoff. Salt tolerant plants can be used in landscaping, but accommodation can also be in preparing for flooding, such as flood road signs, early warning systems, emergency planning, and designated evacuation routes. These will not stop the damage from flooding, but will reduce the risk to human life from the flooding. Next slide. The last strategy is retreat, preferably managed retreat. Retreat is the moving of exposed people and structures out of areas that are often flooded. If done properly, managed retreat is the coordinated, voluntary, and equitable relocation of people and structures away from vulnerable areas. This process may take years or it may take decades. There are numerous options that can take place depending on resources, timeframes, local federal programs, and the desires of the participants. This does not have to be the often believed idea of the government coming in and forcing everybody to leave their homes. With proper planning, managed retreats can be beneficial to all parties involved. I would like to mention a recently developed toolkit by the Georgetown Climate Center that was just finished up this summer. This is an in-depth website toolkit that provides detailed analysis of many types of actions that can take place, including planning, market-based tools, regulatory actions, legal considerations, and also includes numerous examples from across the country. It's very in-depth, pretty much can answer most all your questions about managed retreat. Next slide, please. Before deciding what actions to take, several things need to be taken into consideration. What is the lifespan of the project or area you're trying to protect? It is something that will only be around for 20 or 30 years or 100 years or more. How much risk are you willing to take? If you're planning for a hospital or a school, you might want to use a higher sea level rise scenario. How often are you willing to deal with the impacts? It may not bother you that the road on your house may be flooded every spring tide in 5 years, but in 10 years it may be every high tide, which can pose problems. What is the cost of the proposed adaptation measure? Is it more than what you're trying to protect? Is there a return on the investment? For example, lower insurance rates. What is happening in the surrounding area? Maybe the main road to an area is often flooded while another isn't, but it might take fire and ambulance crews an extra 15 minutes to get to you via the alternate route. Those things have to be considered. Does an adaptation measure require constant upkeep and cost to maintain the protection? And finally, are there ancillary impacts with certain measures? Like Mike mentioned, does raising your property increase flooding on another? Does installing a seawall increase erosion upstream? So to properly adapt to sea level rise, we recommend an in-depth vulnerability analysis followed by careful examination of all feasible options to determine what is best based on costs, timeframes, and risks. Next slide. Listed here are a few sites that provide information on sea level rise and adaptation. Of course, there are many more, along with DNREC and our coastal programs. As Tom said, all this stuff is online, so you don't have to copy these down real quick. Next slide. So if you have any questions later, here's my contact information. And I believe I'll save some time for Susan there, because I know she wants to talk.
Thank you very much, Bob. Next up, we have Susan Love from DNREC also. Welcome, Susan.
Hello, and Bob, thank you for yielding your time to me. I gladly and gratefully accept it, though I am trying to go quickly. Hello, everyone. I'm Susan Love. I'm the administrator of the Climate and Sustainability section, and I'm going to, as quickly as I can, build on the themes of what Kevin, Bob, Mike, and Gina have already presented, and then take you in just a different direction for a second. I think you've heard that the tools that we are using for flooding and water management, engineering, design, and regulations may not be keeping up with current conditions. And I'm going to take a couple minutes to outline how climate change is contributing to this. If I can get my, oh good, thank you, Janelle. So many of the changes you're seeing with flooding and other impacts are driven by human activities like burning of fossil fuels for energy. Humans are causing these changes, and because of that, humans can uniquely solve the problem, both by reducing our emissions and by adapting to the changes that we're seeing on the ground, which we're discussing tonight. The consequences of emissions and increasing greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, you are already very familiar with, and we've already talked about it quite a bit. Rising sea levels, which you've heard about a lot tonight. And as Kevin also alluded to, we anticipate that in addition to sea level rise, we anticipate more precipitation, heavier precipitation events, and overall an increase in precipitation. Again, with more of that occurring in heavy downpour type events. In addition, we anticipate increased temperatures, hotter, longer summers, and hotter, shorter winters. All of this has consequences. And as we move forward to address all of these changes that we're seeing and anticipating in our world, it is important to consider them together when possible. And it can be difficult to consider all of these things together, but as we move forward, it is important to think about how heavy precipitation and sea level rise are going to interact with one another, and how increasing temperatures and warmer winters could also interact with heavy precipitation and sea level rise. And I will note, as others have alluded to, 10 or 20 years ago, people thought, climate change, that's going to be something, my kids can worry about that. It's not going to happen in my lifetime. But we are seeing the impacts today on the ground. It is here today. And these, quickly, I'm going to go through some changes that we've already seen in the state. And this data is courtesy of Dr. Dan Leathers, our state climatologist, and all around great guy. Delaware has already gotten hotter. We have seen warming around 0.2 degrees per decade since the late 1880s. So the world is very, very different for us now than it was 100 years ago. This warming is occurring particularly in the winter months. And so you may not notice it maybe as much because while the third week in July is still really hot when everybody is at the state fair, the mild people don't tend to notice the mild winters as much. The milder winters have implications for growing seasons and precipitation that may or may not come in the form of snow, which then has implications for water use by homeowners, businesses, water management, runoff, and the like. And also, for me and others, it also has significant implications for bugginess, which is a nuisance and a health issue. So specifically in and around Lewes, the data shows that the growing season is growing, right? So the warmer winters and the changes that we're seeing means that the days above 32 degrees when the growing season, what would be considered the growing season, is growing by about a week a decade in Lewes. So this is considerable changes since the time your grandmother's garden in Lewes and now. So all of this is just to show you that these things are happening now. We also have some, as Kevin mentioned, there are some trends in precipitation, but the data is messy. So we have a wet year, a dry year, wet year, a dry year. But in general, we're seeing a little bit more precipitation per decade. And in the future, we anticipate more of this coming as heavy events in addition. And then we've talked about sea level rise, so I'm not going to spend any more time on it. But sea level rise is increasing and the rates are accelerating. So we're seeing these changes and we're all in this together. So state agencies, as well as local governments and businesses, are all working to figure this out, and we're working together to figure out how we deal with these changes now and how we incorporate future conditions into that. And this is a work in progress, folks. And so that's why I'm particularly enthusiastic when local governments try to tackle these very important issues so that we can all work on it together. State agencies, we're trying to figure it out too. How to build more resilient infrastructure and buildings, how to accommodate these changes in our regulations, how to provide the technical assistance that businesses and local governments and others need, while you guys are on the ground also trying to figure out about how do we build more resilient infrastructure and buildings, how do we update our building codes and zoning ordinances to reflect this. And many of you, and Lewes in particular, has been great about reaching out and innovating and building partnerships to try to get answers to these questions. Tom asked me, I think, to give advice. And I wasn't quite sure how to answer that, but as we move forward, here are some best practices, which would be, when possible, consider multiple. I'm not even paying attention. Sorry, there we go. Thank you, Janelle. I'm sorry, I've got two screens going here. Consider multiple climate stressors when you can. Take proactive actions now and adjust over time, right? Everybody wants to do the right thing, and if they change something, they want to make sure that it's perfect. But sometimes we can't predict. And so if we make a choice, move forward, conditions may change over time. We're going to have to be more adaptive over time with the rules and regulations and ordinances and codes that we put on the ground. We have lots of data and tools developed in Delaware for Delaware. And this is something quite special in my work with other states. Many of them are extremely jealous of the resources that we have here in the state of Delaware for towns and businesses to utilize. And always reach out to us and for assistance, because two brains often are better than one. And share your lessons learned, even if there are mistakes, and maybe importantly, if they are mistakes, because we all need to learn from that. So I'm going to be kind to Janelle. Next slide, please. So I do want to take a couple seconds to highlight some of these tools that are available for you. Next slide, please. But I'm going to avoid the ones that Bob has already talked about. So the first one that I want to highlight is, has a really long name, and that's my fault. Avoiding and Minimizing Risk of Flood Damage to State Assets, a guide for Delaware state agencies. Delaware state agencies were directed way back in 2013 to build to a higher standard and to incorporate both sea level rise and floodplain management into how we build and design projects that are funded by state dollars. And at the time, we weren't, how do we do that? Sort of similar to the conversations that Lewes is having today. So we put together a group to really think through this and steal from the best practices of other states. So this document represents our best thinking about how you can approach looking at the need to build something new and first avoid flood risk and then accommodate for sea level rise and future flood risk. So this is something that you can use as an example. It's not a regulatory tool. It is specifically for state planning purposes, but it has definitally use in other places. I will note that this was based on the older sea level rise scenarios that Bob talked about, the ones we did in 2009. So it has not been updated to incorporate the new sea level rise scenarios. But the process is still a good process to follow. So just if you look at this, just swap in the new scenarios for the old scenarios. And Kevin also mentioned, guess Janelle is catching up, is like reading my mind. We also have the Delaware Climate Projections Portal. So most of you have maybe seen the sea level rise projections and know about the maps, but we also serve up state-specific data for heat and precipitation indicators. And this is a tool that not as many people know about, so I really wanted to highlight it and encourage you to take a look and use it in the future. So next slide, please. This portal, which is served out of the University of Delaware and was developed in collaboration and partnership with our state climatologist and others. This portal serves up 55 different indicators and shows what future conditions might look like to the year 2100. It talks about temperature, precipitation, energy-related things, and right here we're showing heating degree days and cooling degree days, and some of you, if you're architects or building professionals, will understand what those terms mean. Growing season, dry days. So you can go in and look at what the future might be. Some of the precipitation projections are a little bit messy, again, because the historical data is a little bit up and down each year. The temperature indicators are quite stark, and the blue lines and the red lines here are projections based upon lower greenhouse gas emission scenarios and higher greenhouse gas emission scenarios. So the red lines are showing what the modeling shows if we continue to emit greenhouse gases as we have in the past. And no surprise that the planet in Delaware warms faster with continued emissions than it does if we can reduce those emissions. So I'm just going to show you a couple things. Next slide for me. This is just one example from that on days with maximum temperature of above 95 degrees. And this is when I start really wilting. So you can see, if you just look at the blue and the red lines, over time, especially towards the end of century, we're going to have many more days over 95 degrees than we do now, or we can expect to have many more days over 95 degrees than we do now. If we continue to emit, greenhouse gases as we have in the past, we will have many more very hot days than we will if we reduce emissions. But when you're building, when you're thinking about heating and cooling, when you're thinking about water use, when you're even thinking about what types of plants to plant in your green infrastructure, you might want to think about future conditions and make sure that what you're planting, if you're planting a tree you want to last for 80 years, you want to make sure that that tree is not a more northern species that might not survive well in these types of conditions. A place to start for all of these resources is declimateinfo.org. We, again, worked in partnership to serve up all of these resources and tools and reports in one place so that you could go search for all of the best Delaware-specific information and data. So the tools that Bob talked about, the climate projection portals, the sea level rise maps, a lot of the research reports, they're all served up on this website. So I'd encourage you to utilize that. And my final slide, I have no idea how I'm doing on time, is just to highlight that the state is right now undergoing a process. For the first time, we are looking at all of these climate stressors together in Delaware's Climate Action Plan. We're bringing together greenhouse gas reduction strategies with adaptation strategies for sea level rise, increased precipitation, increased heat, and putting together a plan that the state can use as a guide for future actions to make sure that the state is both resilient to climate impacts and doing our part to reduce emissions. And there are no easy answers in this document. There are no magic bullets, but many things that we can do to make sure that we're preparing now for the future that we anticipate is happening. It's This plan is due to be released in winter 2021, and we of course look forward to working together with Lewes and other towns to implement some of the resiliency actions in there. And if you're interested in this plan, you can visit the plan's website at declimateplan.org. And if I have any time left, I yield it to the next speaker.
Thank you very much, Susan. So now we'll take questions for Bob and Susan.
So we've got a couple of questions. Let me get to them. Oh, that was from, I know I saw them come in, sorry.
Well, there was one from Kevin, who just had stated that there's a strong correlation between sea level rise and groundwater level in the coastal aquifers. So in areas like Lewes, this could be coming. And then he just asked if anyone on the panel has any other comments on that.
And that goes to a question that we received. Do you anticipate groundwater level rising, and what steps can be taken to mitigate this?
Right.
Yeah, a few years ago, we did have Tom McKenna from Delaware Geological Survey do a study. It was more of a generic model of the area, looking how sea level rise would impact groundwater. That study is on the DGS website. It could be useful, showing how far inland the impacts went, or how far away from any rivers and everything it went. So there has been some work done on that, and possibly might fund future studies into that.
Wonderful.
Any other questions for Bob or Susan?
No other questions?
All right, then we'll move on to Anna Baker from the American Flood Coalition. Welcome, Anna.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tom, and thanks, Janelle. It's really a pleasure to be here, and thanks for the invitation. So I'm Anna Baker. I lead national outreach for the American Flood Coalition, and we can switch to the next slide. So I'll just be giving a brief overview tonight of who we are at AFC, since we are relatively new to Delaware, and also some examples of local actions to address flooding and sea level rise, specifically focused on ordinances, which may be relevant to Lewes community members. Next slide. So we are a national nonprofit and a nonpartisan coalition focused on advancing solutions to flooding and sea level rise. We are philanthropically funded, and membership is free to the over 240 members who have joined the coalition to date. And our current members include a wide range of folks, including members of Congress who sign on as federal champions, along with local and state elected officials, cities, towns, counties, business, military, civic, and academic groups. Next slide. So we were founded almost 3 years ago in Florida and Virginia. That's where most of our membership is based, and we've grown outwards from there since. On the left of this slide, you can see a breakdown of our members by type. We have many smaller communities similar to Lewes within our membership. And then on the right are some examples of some other Mid-Atlantic members in the area, including the Delaware Center for Inland Bays, who we were really proud to welcome as a coalition member earlier this year. Next slide. And we act in a range of ways to support local communities. I won't go through all of these, but just to highlight a little bit of what we do. We produce informational resources, often on topics that our local members request of us. We also fund local grants and pilots to support communities in their resilience efforts, resilience planning specifically. And overall, we focus on bringing our members together within this network so that ideas and resources across different regions and communities can be shared, and so we can raise the profile of the issues nationally. Next slide. So Tom invited me tonight to highlight some local examples of zoning and ordinances specifically, and before diving into that, I wanted to provide this slide as context. This is a very loose diagram that pulls together some common themes from early steps that other communities within our network are taking to address and assess the risks of flooding and sea level rise in their communities, and to sort of initiate that process of developing a strategy. So I think it's helpful to first see, as a lot of the earlier presenters have highlighted, that the zoning and ordinances piece is just one piece of a broader set of actions that can work in concert. And it's also really encouraging that Lewes has already initiated or completed many of the actions on this slide. So next. So this slide is just a high-level intro to zoning and ordinances as local policy-based approaches that can be used to reduce the potential impacts of flooding and sea level rise. And a lot of these approaches, like the higher floodplain development standards and the avoid and accommodate concepts that we've already heard about in the earlier presentations, these approaches tend to include creating standards for managing the intensity and type of development in flood-prone areas, not only to reduce flood impacts today, but especially in anticipation of increased flood impacts and sea level rise impacts in the future. And so what are some of the potential benefits of that? There is that cost savings in terms of preventing damage when a flood happens by raising a home or moving important assets out of the way, the reduced need for major infrastructure, improved effectiveness of natural flood barriers like open spaces, wetlands, other places that can absorb and slow waters. And in so doing, that can also lead to the preservation of open space that can be multi-purpose, that can serve as a park or a recreational space or other purposes, in addition to being really useful for absorbing floodwaters. And most importantly, we hear a lot from the communities we work with who are tackling updates to their ordinances, that the process of bringing flooding and sea level rise concepts into ordinances can really improve community identity around this sense of preparedness for the future as well. In terms of key considerations, this has been mentioned, how important community input is from larger organizations as well as individual community members. It's not a standalone solution. I think it's, we've seen so many examples of the many approaches, for instance, beach renourishment, other approaches that in concert work towards reducing flood risk for a community. And then, especially when a community is doing a comprehensive update, it takes time. And that's an important consideration in terms of how much to address at once. And of course, these are not static standards. The great point was made in the previous presentation to be adaptive and ready to make adjustments as time goes on. Next slide. So here are just a few local examples on the right with links with lots more information if folks are interested. And then on the left, some themes that align with those examples of how ordinances are being designed to be responsive to flooding and sea level rise. So the first theme is creating districts or zones. So the small community of Lancaster, Virginia, created different zones or districts within their community so that areas near tidal shorelines or wetlands have standards requiring larger buffer areas and other approaches to encourage development to stay a safer distance away from these flood-prone areas. Similarly, in the much larger community of Norfolk, Virginia, which is linked at the bottom of the slide, they've created a zone for their highest density future development to be on the highest ground in the community, really planning to densify development in places where they anticipate the lowest risk. The next theme is setting standards to elevate buildings. This is the Freeboard example that's been mentioned in previous presentations. So again, the idea is to encourage smarter development where the ground floor of the building is less at risk of getting wet in a flood because it's higher above the ground. And two example communities, the ones that are listed here, Nags Head and Brevard, North Carolina, both of these communities are interesting because they've taken steps to address that question of, does raising one property increase flooding on another? and how can standards and guidelines be created to help prevent any negative impacts this may have on properties across a community. And so in Brevard, North Carolina, they require all of their new development to conduct a no adverse impact certification, which is essentially like a checklist to ensure there are no harmful flood impacts upstream or downstream of the property. And Nags Head has a slightly different example where property owners placing significant earth or fill to raise portions of their properties would need to provide a professional analysis that this would not cause those negative impacts to surrounding properties. And then the last theme is creating standards or incentives around particular resilience objectives that you may already have in your resilience planning that's already taken place in the community. So really pulling out those objectives and thinking about how they can fit into ordinances. So the example I have here is around preserving natural flood barriers to absorb or slow floodwaters. In Charlottesville, Virginia, they've incentivized developers to increase residential density, for instance, by clustering of single-family homes for more efficient use of land and preservation of open space. And again, that allows more opportunity for the floodwaters to have a functional space for slowing and absorbing of water rather than impacting infrastructure and homes. Norfolk, Virginia, similarly, recently developed a credit for developers where they're rewarded for actions that they take to manage stormwater as part of a development project. So if a permeable pavement element is added where water can sink through the ground instead of running off a paved parking lot, or if there are other elements like parks and rain gardens that can absorb water, those provide credits and allow for other aspects of development to take place. So next slide. That's really just a high-level overview based on what Tom requested me to provide some insights on. I've linked to our resources page just in case anyone is interested in some of the other informational resources that we tend to offer. An upcoming one is a guide on regional resilience partnerships. And beyond that, next slide. My email is here. One last message I'll just provide is that as an organization, AFC doesn't tend to advocate for one solution or another when we're interacting with local communities. We really aim to assist and provide information and resources in a way that supports local decisions. So just really a pleasure to chime in to this discussion today, and looking forward to the next presentation.
Thank you very much, Anna. Are there any questions that came in for?
Somebody just has a question on your membership rates.
Sure. Yeah, we're entirely funded by philanthropic sources, so there is no membership fee.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Sure.
And then there's a more generic question. Are there any current programs, either in Delaware or federally, to buy out flood-prone residential areas? The concept sounds good, but is it politically practical?
There have been some attempts in Delaware to ramp up buyout programs. Most of the floodplain buyout programs in Delaware have been on a case-by-case basis, where a particular situation arose, severe repetitive flood damage in a community where there was a larger interest in the buyout. For example, the need to create additional wetland flood storage associated with I-95 improvements, and the fact that Glenville had been repetitively flooded, created kind of a multi-objective approach where the floodplain buyout was also providing the benefits of after the houses were removed, creating all of the additional flood storage and wetland mitigation that DelDOT needed. When we're talking about floodplain buyouts solely for the purpose of removing flooded homes, there have really been some challenges. The number of people who would like to be bought out is often beyond the means of the community, and land ownership is a major issue. When you're talking about, a checkerboard of maybe flood-prone houses in a neighborhood that has a lot of newer buildings that are built to high standards, there are certainly some practical difficulties with having government-owned parcels in the midst of a residential neighborhood. So I'd say it's an uphill battle.
And we just got one more question. Have there been any legal challenges to prohibition to developing in the floodplain? I'm gonna guess at some point there have been.
Oh, absolutely.
So-
Nationwide, there have been many famous, well-documented court cases. I'm not a legal expert, so I can't weigh in on the outcome of them, but certainly the issue has been heard by many courts.
And then one more question for anybody is, what kind of developer incentives could be offered to avoid building in the floodplain?
Danielle, go ahead. Oh, we can't hear you.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, now we can. Thank you.
Okay. Sorry about that. That question, I wanted to just offer some input on that regarding developer incentives. I think there's an opportunity to monetize resiliency working with the development community. When you think about buying a house, oftentimes, people advertise the new granite countertops and the first floor master bedroom and things like that. But imagine if we design our houses and subdivisions to higher standards, subdivisions with large buffers and ample freeboard and other higher design standards, and we build that into the marketing of the subdivision. I think there might be an opportunity to create a market for that. It certainly could create prestige, give some market power or influence to a very competitive development community if they chose to kind of find that as a niche. So that's just something that I've been throwing out there to anyone that will listen over time.
I think the question was more aimed at, and correct me if I'm wrong, at what type of incentives could we as a city government offer to developers to incentivize greener, more resilient building techniques.
And I think there's things out there, we just have to go find them. I know other towns and other places have examples of things that we can definitely look at.
And
I don't have any off the top of my head.
No, well, I think we have some of that already in our draft ordinances as far as incentives for pervious payment and such. So, all right.
Yeah, and I think the concept of in areas where the flood risk is lower, making it more enticing to develop in those locations by allowing greater density, for instance, just as one example, and in areas where there is greater flood risk, limiting those options is one example. We've definitely seen in multiple forms in different communities. Again, the Norfolk, Virginia example is their developer credit process is complex. So if anyone's interested, I would suggest looking into it in more detail. And then I had one other quick example just on the question around buyouts, it is a very complex process. There are federal programs that are often state-led, as was explained, and I do think there are some positive examples out there of instances where properties that have been repetitively flooded and where community members chose to relocate, having those properties developed as a community asset into a community park. There's a small community in Northfield, Vermont that was very heavily impacted by Hurricane Irene, where a series of properties that were clustered together, the neighbors all decided to relocate, and that space was turned into a park space for the community. So I think thinking of that relocation and buyout process in terms of its value to the community is just one example to highlight as well.
And Susan, did you have something?
Well, Bob will tell you I always have something. But I was going to offer that back to the type of developer incentives that could be offered to avoid building in the floodplain. I want to be cautious about going with an incentive only kind of strategy, and a strategy, you know, a regulation that is realistic and implementable is probably, you know, a most effective strategy. But there is certainly room to combine practical regulations with incentives, and incentives can take all kinds of forms, like density bonuses or a streamlined permitting and the like. But each one of those also has downsides and detriments. So a careful, forward-thinking approach that combines both regulatory actions and maybe some easily achievable incentives for going above and beyond the minimum threshold is a strategy that I would advocate for. But there are certainly lots of things in the land use planning world that you could touch back to offer as incentives, that Lewes may already offer as incentives for doing better than the average for other stuff. So I haven't looked at Lewes's code. Janelle could probably say.
And then we got one more question. Have there been legal challenges to the special district approach in Virginia? Again, I'm going to guess yes, but I don't think anybody on this group, on this panel can definitively say yes or no, but probably yes.
Well, Anna, do you have any experience with how the implementation went down there?
It was a very long process, and it was just put in place about 1.5 years ago. So I think it's being tested as we speak, and I can't speak to the legal challenges aspect. I haven't looked into that piece.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Well, with that, we'll move on to Jessica Watson from Sussex Conservation District.
Thank you for having me. Again, my name is Jessica Watson. I manage the sediment and stormwater program here in Sussex County. Next slide, please. So it's state regulations which were established in 1991 and have been delegated to local agencies. For like Kent County, it's the Kent Conservation District, and Sussex, the Sussex Conservation District, and then up north in Newcastle County gets a little more complicated. But it requires all land disturbing activities of 5,000 square feet or more are required to have a plan in place. Some of those plans are just sediment and erosion control, kind of depending on the level of construction, and then also into more detailed stormwater management. So next slide, please. Delegation responsibility. So the Conservation District, we are tasked with reviewing plans for compliance with the state regulations. So anything that disturbs that 5,000 square feet is required to submit some type of plan to our office for review. So whether you're building a single family house to a commercial project to a large subdivision, it's coming through our office. We inspect that project until it's fully constructed, meaning every house is constructed. We also have a maintenance inspector on staff who goes out and inspects closed out projects to make sure that stormwater facilities are functioning as designed. And then we also provide outreach and education. Next slide, please. So during that plan review process, it is a lengthy process. You know, once a project receives preliminary approval from the county or municipality, then that design consultant starts to schedule meetings with our office. And that's really when we get into more of the site challenges. You know, we'll look at GIS information, soils, floodplain, just all the challenges associated with the project. And we talk to the designer about how they're going to show and demonstrate compliance with the state sediment and stormwater regulations for that project. And then they submit that project to us, and usually it takes several reviews for a project to be approved. And then we're also reviewing for sediment and erosion control, meaning, you know, the black silt fence that you see around the construction site, you know, all those controls that are in place during that interim phase until the stormwater is fully operational. Next slide, please. So as we've talked about tonight, and everybody is aware, you know, we are challenged with a high groundwater table in certain areas of Sussex County and in Lewes. You know, that's just something that's definitely discussed when a project is submitted to our office for review, you know, how we're going to deal with those challenges. So, and that was kind of discussed or questioned earlier. You know, there's times when a project where we have tidal surges. So when a project is reviewed, they are required to manage the 2, 10, and 100-year storm. And so we do look at those, the backflows coming into the ponds and how that's going to function up to the 100-year storm. So we have to make sure during our review process that structures are not going to flood. So we realize that roadways will flood temporarily, but houses should be protected. So all of that is reviewed in their sediment and stormwater submittal. Next slide, please. So, and again, we're very flat. So that's our other challenge is, you know, our ditches a lot of times run full. So, you know, during the winter months, we'll see water sitting in a lot of our ditches. I mean, the land was ditched in order for us to even to have to farm, to drain the land, to draw the water table down. And now a lot of those farm fields are now becoming residential communities. So we look at all of that in the stormwater design and how that stormwater facility is going to outfall and how that ditch is going to drain. So all of that is included in the stormwater review. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. And our other challenge, poorly drained soils. So in some areas of Sussex County, we have excellent infiltration, very sandy soils. And then in others, you know, we are very challenged with that high water table. So really depending on what those site conditions are going to be, you know, that's how it's determined what type of stormwater facility is going to be able to utilize for that particular site. So if it has a high water table, obviously, you know, they're most likely going to have a wet pond that's going to provide stormwater management. If we have really excellent soils and we have good separation from seasonal high groundwater, then maybe an infiltration practice. So we are definitely limited to what the site conditions are as to what stormwater facility is going to work in that location. So the different types of stormwater facilities, you know, wet ponds, dry ponds, infiltration ponds, even underground systems, especially along Route 1, where we do have good separation from groundwater and excellent infiltration. Real estate is very valuable, and developers don't want to take it up with a stormwater facility. They do have the option of underground stormwater systems. So that's something that we do see, especially along Route 1. Next slide, please. So how a stormwater pond functions, whether a swale or closed storm drain system, that water is directed to the stormwater facility, and then that pond provides water quality treatment, meaning sediment is allowed to settle out. Detention is typically 48 hours, and it slowly goes through that low flow structure, that kind of hole on the side of the outlet structure, And then in larger storm events, the water is conveyed to the pond, and it's managed to meter the 10 and 100-year storm event. So our regulations have changed over the last couple of years. In 2006, the 100-year storm changed, design storm changed to what it is today, which is 9.2 inches in 24 hours. Previously, it was 7.9 inches in 24 hours. And our regulations changed again in 2014 and 2016. And with those regulations, stormwater projects or stormwater facilities are now required to manage the 100-year storm to a pre-development rate. So older regulations, they were not required to manage the 100-year. They only had to safely convey it. So our regulations have changed over time. It has become more restrictive. And as I said, the newer projects are required to manage it. So that is a big change over the last couple of years. Next slide, please. Sediment and stormwater inspections. So we do have 4 inspectors on staff, and they are inspecting all active construction projects throughout the county. And as I said earlier, we can't close projects out until every home is constructed. So we are very busy, and we have subdivisions, some of which have been under our responsibility for 10, 15 years just because they have not completed construction. We provide weekly, bi-weekly inspection, really kind of depending on the level of construction, technical assistance, drainage complaints, and outreach. So our staff is pretty busy, and I'll tell you what, this last month with the 12 inches of rain in November has kept our office very busy. Next slide, please. A contractor is required to have a blue card certification with DNREC. So any contractor who is doing work on a project is required to be certified with DNREC. They take a class and take a test called the blue card class. And so that contractor has to give us their card saying that they're certified to do this level of construction before they can start that project. The approved plan has to remain on site. The developers are required to perform self-inspection reporting as part of their NPDES construction permit and maintains all reports on site. And so our staff works with the developer and the contractor to ensure that they maintain compliance with their approved plan. Next slide, please. So compliance enforcement tools. So I had mentioned our delegation responsibility. It did not include enforcement. So the Conservation District does not have enforcement ability. We don't have the ability to write tickets. I can write very nasty violation letters. And we do have the ability to hold up building permits. So that's really the leverage that we use to maintain compliance on sites. And if we have to go to the next level, we refer the project to DNREC for enforcement action. But most of the time before we get to that level, there's on-site meetings with contractors, developers. We notify them of the violation, what they need to do to work towards compliance. We also require CCRs, a certified construction reviewer, who is another inspector who helps the district out in overseeing that project, generating reports and making sure that they're complying with the approved plan. So that is how we're able to maintain compliance on projects. We do have a good working relationship with most of the developers and contractors, not all, but everybody pretty much knows each other in Sussex County, and they want to work with us. They know that they have to work with us on the next project that they want to do. So we feel that we do have a good working relationship with most contractors and developers out there. Next slide, please. So stormwater pond maintenance. So we do have a maintenance inspector on staff. We are working towards trying to get a total number of stormwater facilities that have been completed in Sussex County. We do not have that total right now. We're working on a database to help us track all of these. But our inspector does go out and reviews all of the closed out projects and generates a report and tries to send it to an HOA or developer to let them know how their stormwater facility is functioning. Next slide, please. So leaving buffers, this is an encouraged best management practice. It's not something that's regulatory. It seems to be a big discussion items in a lot of communities. Either residents hate or love the buffer. We strongly encourage the buffer. It provides additional water quality treatment. Next slide, please. So things that we work with communities on, trimming, maintenance of vegetation. These are all things that look, pretty insignificant. However, this can really impact how a stormwater facility functions. So it can be quite costly if neglected. So drainage is so important in our county, making sure that our ditches are operating, our stormwater is functional. So providing this maintenance is key to minimizing any kind of flooding impact. We want to make sure that our stormwater system is able to function appropriately during that large storm event. Next slide, please. So maintenance inspection reports, things that we're looking for, we're looking for the typical things, routine maintenance, invasive vegetations, critters, and stuff like that. But we're also looking at, for potential major failures, whether the ditch is backflowing into the pond, are there obstructions? Is the pond functioning as designed? Is it holding more water than it's supposed to? Has storage been compromised? So we're looking at multiple things, and the whole intent is to notify the owner as soon as possible. The sooner that they can address these issues, hopefully the less costly it's going to be long term. Next slide, please. So again, drainage is key. Making sure that ditches are operational. In this picture, a ditch was treated, the Phragmites was treated and cut down. You can see it on the box structure. This community was trying to make sure that their ditch was fully operational. It did need to be cleaned out. But these are things to be mindful of and watch during routine storm events, just regular storm events, and even big storm events. Things can change. A lot of these ditches are functioning as streams, and they meander and change over time. And then we've got the whole human factor of, people changing things in the ditches or throwing things in it and how that impacts everything. So really watching how your stormwater works, just in regular rain events, so that you're prepared for the larger ones. Next slide, please. So I always like to kind of wrap up on a good note, successful maintenance. I do have to say, in our coastal area in Sussex County, we do have a lot of beautiful stormwater facilities. I mean, people do a really good job. You can see the wildlife, you can see the buffers when you're driving around, the fountains. Those are all things that are kind of above and beyond the regulations, where people are doing a good job and trying to be stewards of the land. Next slide. So there are a lot of great resources on our website. There's a homeowner section with lots of fact sheets on swales and all kinds of presentations and PowerPoints that we've done over the past year that are a good resource for homeowners. And my contact information is on there. Email is usually the best way to get up with me. Thank you for the opportunity tonight.
Jessica, thank you very much. We've got a bunch of questions here now.
Let me get back to them. Lots of them coming in.
I know, I could kind of see them coming in.
You're very popular, Jessica.
Okay, so it looks like the first one, what laws are there in Delaware to require developers and realtors to disclose flooding risks to potential buyers?
I don't think that I can answer that. I don't know about that. I mean, I thought that all of that was supposed to be disclosed, but that's not something that I can comment on.
There is a real estate disclosure law, or a seller's disclosure law that someone could go look at and see what the questions are that are contained on the seller's disclosure form. I think to the way the question was sent in, Janelle, when it says flood risk, that's a pretty broad flooding risks.
Yes.
That's a pretty broad ambition for someone, who may have owned property for 5 years to be able to disclose. They may legitimately really not know what their flooding risks are. More likely, they would be required to disclose to the buyer that the property is located in a floodplain.
And we did get a response from a real estate standpoint. It would be disclosed and revealed during the process. If mortgage, flood insurance is most usually required, is that response. Another question, are there any proposals for accommodating sea level rise, increasing precipitation in stormwater regulations?
Okay, all right, and that's a good question. So our regs were just updated in, well, 2016 and then again 2019. And so at this point, there is nothing in the regulations addressing sea level rise. It's state regulations, and we're the local delegated authority, so it's not something that I can change. It's going to be up to DNREC whether that's something that's going to change in our stormwater regs.
Are developers and builders required to adhere to the observe the recommendations in the PLUS reports for building in different types of areas, especially wetlands or forested areas? Are there specific soils and or areas that should absolutely not be developed for housing or other purposes?
So
I don't, oh.
I was going to say I can address that. Part of what I do in our office is coordinate PLUS comments for the department. So if you've seen PLUS comments from the department, those are coming from my shop, and all of the recommendations in the PLUS reviews and the PLUS comments are just that. They are best practices. They are recommendations. PLUS recommendations have no force of law, and so if we have a regulation, often you'll see the PLUS comments will specify what the requirements are for stormwater, but those requirements are regulatory requirements. So with or without a PLUS letter, you have to do those things. We often provide information about forested areas, wetland areas, habitat, hydric soils, so soils that are wet, and buffer recommendations. But if there's no statutory or regulatory authority backing that up, then it's just something that we say, hey, we think this is important and you should try to design it into your design. So most of the recommendations do not have the force of law in any way, shape, or form.
So, and Janelle, I think you and I can chime in here that PLUS recommendations come down to the Lewes Planning Commission. And then it's up to the local zoning authority, which is Lewes Planning Commission, as to whether we make them a requirement of the development or not.
Yes, the local jurisdiction has the ability to add additional conditions depending on the type of application for different requirements. If the recommendation comes through and then that jurisdiction wants that to become a requirement, they can do that as a condition. So we've got a bunch of questions, and I'm just going to wrap them into one because they all really look like they're asking the same thing. Is more or less, has sea level rise been taken into consideration for today's stormwater management planning or tomorrow's stormwater management planning or future stormwater management planning?
No, I mean, at this point, what they're required to do is they're required to address water quality, and then they're to demonstrate that they are managing the 2, 10, and 100-year storm to a pre-development rate. So they're not looking at sea level rise in the current stormwater regulations. You know, that could potentially change with new DNREC regulations, and you know, the district would then be responsible for reviewing that. But at this point, that is not something that's looked at.
So I don't know if someone from DNREC, Mike, I don't know if can you chime in on that, or Bob?
Well, I just want to say, you know, as Susan mentioned, we're developing the climate action plan for state agencies. And one of the recommendations in that plan will probably be to look at all these types of regulations and see if they can be modified to include factors to sea level rise and climate change. So it is something that will be considered. Time frames to be determined.
Because I think the reason why there are so many questions on this is that it's a rather urgent question, because we're approving, reviewing and approving based upon current regulations, and we're putting infrastructure in the ground that, based upon everyone's presentation, we feel is kind of outdated. Is there anything we can do in the interim?
Jessica, do you know if any municipalities set higher standards than state standards?
I mean, that's a good question. I don't know of any that are requiring some type of study in regards to sea level rise. So, with the current regulations, with the management of the 210 and 100, I don't know of anybody being more restrictive than that. And really what you're looking for is the sea level rise factor. And I don't know anybody who is implementing any standards to address that.
Well, I would throw on top of that, based upon Kevin's presentation, we saw that we've had 4 24-hour 10-year events in the last 10 years. So the probability of 4 1% events happening within a 10-year interval is statistically fairly low. And as Kevin had said, that we're probably under designing our stormwater management facilities. So the combination of not addressing sea level rise and questioning the actual precipitation data combined seems to put us at a greater risk.
And I know there was a question. The city of Rehoboth actually does look at and requires more detailed plans for 2,500 square feet of disturbance and not the 5,000 square feet. So they do take a little bit of a different path. So that is a slight difference. So a couple more questions, because then we've got a couple more people to get to. Based on stormwater systems, particularly in the low-lying areas and the coastal flooding, should be looking at I think it was elevating our stormwater management. And I think that would be difficult, Jessica, because we're just so flat.
Yeah, it would be. It sounds easier than it is. There's so many factors, and that question that was asked earlier about just raising the outlet. Well, there's so many consequences to raising an outlet and looking at the whole drainage system. So, there's really a lot of impacts if you're raising that property up significantly. And what does that mean for neighboring parcels? So it's, it's difficult. It's challenging. I can't say each site is unique, and there's impacts, potentially to the neighbors, and wanting to make sure that that stormwater system functions as designed. So, all I can tell you guys, at this point, all of that's looked at for the 100-year storm. But when we get to this next level, that's a whole nother challenge, and I'm not exactly sure how we're going to address that.
And then we got a question, and this is not for Jessica, this is for anybody who can answer this one. If there's a nearby site conditions that include high water tables, and there's a concern about should ribs or wastewater treatment and spray irrigation on farm be approved or denied in that area. And I think that actually goes through a separate review permit from DNREC, is my understanding for that. And then a question, if the stormwater basin fails, is the HOA liable and responsible for the repair? Jessica, they are responsible, correct?
Yeah, I mean, the process for, and so the stormwater program has been around since 1991. So we've had, hundreds, several thousand stormwater facilities constructed. We haven't really had any major failures, but the process for closeout is there is an as-built survey of the facility to make sure that it was built correctly and that it has the appropriate storage volume. And then it's turned over to an HOA in good working condition. And then they should be doing routine preventive maintenance of that stormwater facility. If it does fail, and they are maintaining it, it is their responsibility. If it's not turned over to them and it's under developer maintenance responsibility, the developer would be fixing it. But all I can recommend is make sure that you're watching those ponds carefully and looking at areas of erosion, because the longer you wait, the more expensive it is to fix.
And then somebody wants to know if somebody can explain the NPDES regs for developers. They thought there was no drainage to waterways and creeks.
I don't know, so that gets really in the weeds a little bit on the NPDES regs for developers. So in order to go to construction, they do have to, under the EPA requirement, they're required to file what's called an NOI, a notice of intent to discharge during construction activity. So the plan, the sediment and stormwater plan and that permit together that they file with DNREC allows that developer to go to construction for that project. And under that permit, there's detailed responsibilities of these weekly self-inspections. And it kind of gets into the weeds a little bit. I'd be happy to explain it and not bore everybody on what that process is. But I'm not sure the question, I thought there was no drainage to waterways. All of the stormwater facilities, unless it's an infiltration practice, is discharging to some type of waterway.
Like, I got two more. Is there a way for the general public to know which developers are compliant and which ones are not?
I mean, it's not something that we generally go out saying who are the bad guys. It's, your inspection reports can be FOIA'd, plans can be FOIA'd. So we wouldn't really just say, label somebody as non-compliant, but all of that information is available to the public if requested.
And then the last question we've got is, how can we encourage developers not to build in the vulnerable areas? And I think we've kind of had that discussion tonight, is how do we incentivize it? What kind of regulations do we look at? And I think it's going to end up being a combination of different things that will end up addressing how to protect those areas.
Right, I agree. I think it is a combination of different things and agencies working together to incentivize that.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you.
Thank you very much, Jessica. So we move on now to Gordon Woodrow from DNREC. This is a little bit separate from the main topic we've been talking about, but it is related to stormwater management and the MS4 program. So Gordon, we turn it over to you.
Good evening. I'm Gordon Woodrow. I'm the program manager for there's the term NPDES, the National Pollutant Discharge and Elimination System. It's a wide-ranging federal program under the Clean Water Act that covers everything from what you just heard about from Jessica in the construction phase. It also includes individual wastewater permits, which all of our wastewater treatment facilities, power plants, you name it, if it's discharging to waters of the state or of waters of the US, then a NPDES permit is required. One aspect of that is municipal stormwater, which is a key component. The next slide, please. So the MS4 program is the Municipal Separate Storm Sewer System. This is the system of inlets, conveyance pipes, and then eventually outlets that move rainwater away from your roads and homes and out to the nearest water body. And typically, the MS4 will discharge water untreated unless it's caught by stormwater management pond, swale, or some other structure. So it is a bigger risk in terms of stormwater quality than our individual wastewater treatment plants or others that go through a treatment process. Within the state of Delaware, Newcastle County is entirely covered by one, it's a major MS4 permit called the Phase 1 permit. Newcastle County and DelDOT both are principal permittees for this, and they have co-permittees, which work together to maintain their water quality programs and their stormwater management plan, which I'll get into in a minute. In Kent County, we have several, including Dover, Middletown, and DelDOT again. And then currently we have a new permit, which is going to be a general permit, which is going to be coming out, where we'll see the first two Sussex County communities to be permitted under this program. That's Seaford and Laurel. Thank you. You're good at this. Yeah, so this is actually an EPA delegated program. It's delegated to DNREC, and then as Jessica brought out, that there are delegated agencies who handle the construction and post-construction elements of the MS4 program. What the criteria for being permitted as a municipality depends primarily on population size. So every 10 years, the EPA will review the decennial US Census maps, look at the population size, and then we'll also look at other water quality risk factors in watersheds to determine which communities would be required to have an MS4 permit. That's the primary way. So every 10 years, they would look at that and designate other communities. We have the ability to waive some of those communities depending on risk factors. And then DNREC also has authority to designate communities that have a high risk population, a wide range of factors. We have a designated criteria for that. MS4 permits, they're run on a 5-year cycle, so they will peel out every 5 years. The first year of an MS4 permit primarily is just to develop the stormwater management program, which is the foundation of everything you're going to be doing for the next indefinite number of years. Next slide, please. The core component of the MS4 program is your stormwater management plan. I will say that your coastal communities have got a huge jumpstart on this whole program. Backing up a little bit to Bob Scarborough's team and Susan's team, the coastal communities, Lewes, Rehoboth, Henlopen Acres, Bethany, South Bethany, all the way down to Fenwick Island, all participated for 2 years in a study that looked at what's most important to you regarding stormwater management, what type of ordinances do you think you should have in place, and what type of stormwater management structures would most be conducive to helping your communities with regard to stormwater quality and flood control. And that study completed last year, and there's some documents out there that came out as part of that. A lot of energy was generated from it, and I know even today during our times with COVID, many of these communities are still actively working on stormwater management projects. I'm going to applaud Lewes and others for doing this. The 6 minimum control measures of the plan, there's some key things in here that some of it's common sense, you know, with regard to how are we dealing with our stormwater, how are we making sure our land isn't being flooded, our water quality is not being degraded. Different communities have different reasons for wanting to make sure that their water quality is maintained. Coastal communities in particular have an economic need to make sure, because of tourism, that you have clean water, the beaches are clean, they're not contaminated with bacteria. So the first 2 aspects are particularly important in that part, where you not only have to educate the public about not polluting into the storm drainage, and it's more than just putting a placard on the ground next to the inlet, but you also have tourism. So they come in, and that's a very difficult thing, is how do you educate tourists not to pollute the water that's there. There's another part of the program, which is public participation and involvement. I know Lewes, Rehoboth, and other communities are very active in doing things, working in concert with non-governmental organizations, your own communities. These are things you're actively doing more than many other communities I've seen in Delaware and in the Mid-Atlantic. Another element is called the illicit discharge detection and elimination. Basically, this is the program, the part of the program which you kind of act as the enforcement for your own community, where you're inspecting outfalls to make sure that pollutants aren't coming out of the end of the pipe, contaminating your soils, which could be your waters, which could be bacteria, could be nutrients, could be oil, garbage, and what they call floatables, which are basically plastic bags and everything else. This part of the program also creates a hotline system locally where, whether you're using the DNREC Environmental Crimes Hotline Unit call line or having one of your own, under this kind of permit, the permittees are required to follow up on any type of incidents where they're reporting the discharge of pollutants to your MS4 and following up with that with the support of DNREC, of course. And the next two elements, Jessica already covered thoroughly and she did a very good job of talking about stormwater management systems. The MS4 program is a bit of an overarching element to that whole program, where as part of this comprehensive stormwater management program, you're working with your delegated agency. In some cases, the permittee, like for instance, the city of Newark, is their own delegated agency. So they're doing that all within themselves. City of Wilmington, same thing. But either way, there are permit requirements, NIPD's permit requirements, to make sure that the construction, the sediment and stormwater program is working effectively. Post-construction, the critical part of this, which Jessica alluded to, is making sure that post-construction, that these stormwater management ponds and other facilities are maintained adequately. So 20 years from now, we're not wondering what happened, and all of these facilities are starting to degrade to a point where we're losing the function of them to either control the stormwater quantity or the stormwater quality. And then the other component is pollution prevention and good housekeeping. This is all the elements of street sweeping, making sure that road salt is kept to a minimum, anything that you can pull off the roadways and make sure they're not going down in the storm drain is really cheap insurance for you compared to putting stormwater ponds everywhere. Street sweeping is actually a very good and cost-effective way to making sure that you're maintaining water quality. Next slide. So stormwater planning and sea level rise. I thought about this for a while, Tom. You asked me to talk about this. Sea level rise, as I see it, sea level rise is a factor. It's unfortunately, it'll be a constant that we'll all have to deal with in coastal communities. And the effects are going to be increased floods, less land area that you're going to have to deal with, increases in water quality. And it really comes down, in my mind, it comes down to effective long-term planning on land use and trying to project, like the slides, the kind of shocking slides that Bob put up of what we're going to be looking at. And I know we've seen some of the maps and projections of 50 and 100 years of what Lewes looks like, or the city of Newcastle or Delaware City. I mean, you guys aren't the only one in this boat. There's a lot of coastal communities who are looking at the same thing. In that vein, and I'll probably get to this in a future slide, but I'm going to bring it up now. I think some of the greatest things that you guys can do to help yourselves as a planning committee is to talk with others who are in a similar situation and hope to find the ones that have already gone down this road and have done a lot of work on land use planning. And it could be some of the communities I talked about here. City of Wilmington is another one. It could be within Delaware, but it could also be on the other side of Delaware Bay. It could be reaching out to New Jersey and finding out what some of those communities are doing. Not reinventing the wheel is universal. This is particularly true because this is a lot of money we're talking about when we're trying to figure out where you should plan and what it's going to look like 50 years from now. And so I highly encourage, and as part of the MS4 program, and what I would just call, instead of stormwater, MS4, just think of it as stormwater long-term planning. You're building the foundation of how to manage your stormwater, how to control floods, and I'll get into resources of how that can help you and what we can do to help you. But I think if you look at sea level rise, it's going to just be another factor that is a constant you're going to have to look at when you're dealing with stormwater management. Right, so some important documents. With a stormwater management program, you'll have a written document. And each year, as you go through and develop the plan and start implementing it, you're going to, I say this as you guys don't have a permit on this yet, but you are actually doing a lot of these kind of things. What you do with the stormwater management plan is to evaluate what type of activities among those 6 control measures are working well for you, which things are creating the biggest bang for the buck, and then adapting that plan, making that a living document where that plan grows and expands to increase the effectiveness of what you're doing to improve water quality and flood control. And then those every year, MS4 permittees, the municipalities are required to submit an annual report at DNREC describing their activities on what they've done in relation to those elements, and then how they have reviewed the effectiveness of the program and then made changes for continuous improvement. And then farther down the road, I just threw this in here, but the more seasoned MS4s have pollutant reduction plans where they actually look at their watershed and try to figure out how can they improve permeability or capture stormwater within stormwater management facilities like ponds or swales to improve water quality. And so they actually do have programs where they're going to reduce the amount of pollution that they're producing. So in this slide, and I know, Tom, you wanted me to talk a little bit more on this one, I think. Here's some things, whether you're an MS4 permitted under the NIPDES program and you're required to do this, or whether it's just in your best interest to manage your stormwater, here's some things that I think can help you all. Involving your community in preventing water pollution. Going back to education and outreach, not just having a few flyers or something out, but actually engaging the community in projects like streamside cleanups or repainting the inlets, having Coast Day. That's Coast Day is an awesome event that you guys have in that area. Just incredible. Things like that. Mitigation for flooding and sea level rise. These are things which are the big ticket items that are cost money. Stormwater facilities cost money. But there are opportunities to offset those costs with things like the state revolving water fund, where you can get low cost or low interest loans for developing infrastructures, or you can get matching grants. FEMA also, through DEMA, has hazard mitigation grants and loans that you can apply for. Sometimes they're a little hard to get through, but there is assistance available, and through the Division of Water, we can help you navigate through the FEMA grants for hazard mitigation. If you have projects that are that you think are valuable, that are going to improve water quality and at the same time reduce flood, that's like 2 birds with 1 stone. You've got a much better chance of getting grants when you can include both of those as factors. I already talked about economic benefits of making sure you have clean water, in your communities. There's a wide range of reasons for that. And then, I've talked about most of that. Yep. So current progress. Like from me looking at this from the outside, you know, how are you guys doing? We're having this conversation right now. This event tonight is a major step forward. I don't see this in other MS4 regulated communities. You know, this level of interest is astounding. So, you know, again, my compliments to you all on putting this together. The Resilient Community Partnership, Bob Scarborough's group I talked about this a little earlier, but having the Coastal Communities Assessment of Impervious Cover project, which was supported by DNREC and NOAA funding, was an excellent opportunity to bring a lot of the coastal communities together to work together. Can't stress how important it is for communities within a watershed system to work together. There's tons of things for creating opportunities for your local citizenry and cost effectiveness. You can't beat working together. I mean, there's so many things you can do by just all collaborating together. And that also includes, I mean, you've got a lot of non-government organizations. You got Sea Grant, you got the inland bays, you know, the list goes on and on. You got the university there. You guys are in a really good spot. You also have a lot of risks. You're in sea level rise country. And yeah, so I'll kind of leave it at that. I want to make it clear that what's next. We have the 2020 census coming out. That'll be available sometime in 2021. Originally, they talked about the data will be coming out in April. At that point, EPA, each region looks at their states and decides where are the urbanized areas expanding and growing. And then based on those urbanized areas, they will designate MS4s. Usually they're always smaller MS4s. The large ones are permanent. And then they'll do that in consultation with DNREC in our office to figure out what makes sense. We do have waiver criteria for very small, low risk communities. We have designation criteria if we feel like something got missed because of the census, but the risk to water quality is very high. Or we have seasonality where we have flooding of people into an area that pose a greater risk to water quality. So we'll be doing that in 2021, which will be here before you know it. And then I'll also mention that our department and the Division of Water and other parts of DNREC, we do work together with stormwater management activities. We try and find ways we can work together to help communities that need the support. We do look for grant funding and reach out and try and get you that. We also have internal staff that provide technical support for stormwater management. So I'll thank you and I'll open it.
Well, thank you very much, Gordon. We have about 10 minutes left before, so we've invited Kim Hoey Stevenson from Sussex County Planning just to give her views on what Sussex County is doing. There are no slides associated with this, so Kim, turn that over to you.
Thanks, Tom. You have a very thorough panel here, let me tell you. And I'm really glad I got to go after Jessica because she always does such a great job and she explains so many things. It's great. And she did it in a much nicer way. I always tell people I'm from here. And so I always tell people, like, you understand that Sussex County is a swamp, right? We've built on a swamp. But anyway, in Sussex County, yes, we have the comprehensive plan that we update every 10 years, as every incorporated entity does in the state. And our last one was in 2018, where, yes, we considered sea level rise and climate change and everything that we can think of to throw into the comprehensive plan for the next 10 years, which we then are always looking at as we go through. Janelle can tell you many stories about that. Under that, in everyday life, we have we have adopted the Fema flood maps as the maps that we use because they take historical data and they are updated about every 10 to 15 years, and they also take in account the community input on those. So under that, we have what is known as Ordinance 2384, which is our ordinance about building in a floodplain and what you have to do with that. And under that controls everything, designs of buildings, how subdivisions are put together, protecting the water supply, where fill dirt can be put, development areas within flood zones, and what can be done within that. And we go through the plus comments of everything that comes through, and we do what we can with that. I mean, we even have under 2384, we have a floodplain administrator, and who that person has approval and disapproval of applications as far as whether they are following the ordinances for what needs to be done in the floodplain. So Sussex County was recent in 2019. They actually had what's known as a community assisted visit with Fema, which is basically FEMA comes in and goes over our procedures and what we're doing, and they had a very favorable rating for Sussex County and said we're doing a great job with what we have. So from that we're down to the end. So I didn't want to take a lot of time, but I'm happy to answer any questions that anybody has.
The one question I'd have, Kim, is what do you think the ways that Lewes and Sussex County planning could potentially work together to harmonize the areas where we interface?
Well, we're always looking for, within the comprehensive plan, we talked about where development should be, and should it be around town centers where there's better infrastructure in place. And so ways that we could work together would be a great way to sit down and talk about how we see things going, so that we're not in conflict with each other. One saying, well, the development should go here, and someone else saying, no, the development should go there. That would be one. And certainly working with the different ordinances so that we have some consistency. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. All right, well, thank you very much. And with that, Danielle Swallow is going to do wrap up for us, just to give some general thoughts on what's been presented this evening.
Yeah, hi, and I'm going to be pretty brief. I know it's late, and I'm Danielle Swallow, a coastal hazards specialist with Delaware Sea Grant, and I'm also part of the RASCL network, the Resilient and Sustainable Communities League. Resilience is all about anticipating changes, changing conditions, and working to both manage and mitigate those changes so that we can weather those changes or bounce back more readily from them. And a lot of what I think we heard today was that there's a lot of good processes in place, but they don't all encompass future conditions. They don't all factor in our changing environment, our changing climate, and so higher standards are needed. And if our regulations aren't able to incorporate them immediately, we can think about how to address it through adding in additional margins of safety where we can, and coming up with incentive programs and things of that sort. I think it's really important to emphasize that a holistic approach to resilience is needed. We need to weave higher standards through all aspects of policy and plans at the local level, including the county level. And so that might include things like our comprehensive plans, our emergency management plans, our hazard mitigation plans, even like our historic preservation plans. Resilience should be a vision that the community buys into and it can express in policies and plans. And it's important that vision think about not only the properties that are maybe in the path of the hazard, but also the systems, the built infrastructure, the natural resources. Something I didn't hear as much about, I think it was definitely mentioned, but I want to emphasize, it's just how important our natural resources are, especially when we're thinking about, causes of flooding. Flooding is caused by a variety of things. We talked a lot about sea level rise today. We talked about precipitation. So sometimes you just get those heavy rainfall events that aren't particularly tied to, you know, like a tropical system offshore. But then you have those tropical systems or subtropical systems, and you know, our nor'easters that can bring, you know, precipitation along with wind and storm surge and other factors. So that, you know, that adds to flooding. And then we have just our tides, right? Our high tides are getting higher. Our low tides are getting higher because of sea level rise. So we can experience, you know, periodic flooding, nuisance flooding just from a high tide cycle. So altogether, we've got different factors that are contributing to increasing flood risk in our community. And our natural resources are an important defense to that. So the better that we're able to maintain them, keep them from being degraded, the better able they'll be able to provide the defenses that they do. They help attenuate wave action, they absorb inundation, they benefit water quality and provide habitat and things like that. And so I think that's important, is not to, you know, to make sure we're maintaining our natural resources like our wetlands, but also that we're, you know, that we're working very hard to maintain the footprint of them, and to keep the beneficial functions of a natural floodplain intact. I also wanted to mention that there's a third component. I mentioned property and I mentioned systems like our natural resources, but there's also people. And when we're thinking about resiliency, we need to think about the people that are in our community, and you know, how flooding or, you know, these different hazards can disproportionately affect some groups over others. So thinking holistically, you know, is so important in terms of trying to build resilience in a community, and it takes active management over time, which is something we heard tonight. Actively working to adapt and being flexible and kind of changing the approach as conditions change if needed. We have to be nimble and flexible in that regard. So I think I'm gonna just pause there because of the time.
Thank you very much. I want to thank everyone for participating. I think this gives us an awful lot of material to help us through the code revisions that we're doing, and a lot of good reference material. I want to especially thank Mike Powell. He has been instrumental at getting me in touch with all of the right people and being of great assistance. So with that, I think, so there's a question. Janelle, we did record this, correct? And it will be up as the rest of the city meetings?
Correct. It will be up on our YouTube page tomorrow at some point.
Mm-hmm.
And as Danielle said, the Rascal Summit is next week.
Yes. And if anyone's ever been to one, they're actually phenomenal education programs.
And all the presentations are currently on the city's website. Just look under the government and then the planning activities page for planning developments.
All right, with that, thank you all and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.